he suddenly realized that the forest in front of him was somewhat unusual, sharp and alert. He continued moving forward while cautiously scanning his surroundings. Sure enough, not far away, he spotted a carriage overturned on the ground. Wary, Kid immediately pulled out his rifle and approached to investigate. He also noticed a long trail of blood on the ground, clearly left behind by something that had been dragged. Holding his rifle at the ready, Kid slowly followed the blood trail forward. Before long, he saw a black man hanging from a tree not far ahead. To his surprise, he also noticed a young girl in the distance, staring blankly at him. The moment she realized she had been spotted, the girl turned and ran, uncertain of the situation. Kid immediately chased after her. As he ran, Kid shouted to the girl that he was not a bad man, but the girl ignored him completely and kept running with all her strength. After a tense pursuit, Kid finally caught her, yet the girl was like a terrified little wild animal, screaming wildly, struggling desperately, and even grabbing Kid's arm to bite down on it with all her force. After a fierce struggle between the two, the girl finally began to calm down, not wanting to agitate her further. The kind-hearted Kid stood several meters away from her. He asked the girl what had happened and said he wanted to take her home. However, the girl seemed unable to understand what Kid was saying. After questioning her for quite some time, the girl finally spoke a sentence in an indigenous language that Kid could not understand. Kid looked at the girl in front of him in astonishment. He had no idea what had happened to her. He understood even less why a white girl was speaking an indigenous language. He slowly extended his hand and began to approach her. Sensing that Kid meant no harm, the girl followed him back to the carriage. Kid carefully searched through the carriage, trying to find something that could prove the girl's identity. But at that very moment, a squad of soldiers suddenly burst out from the woods behind them. Startled, the girl immediately hid again. The captain checked Kid's identification while listening to his account of what had happened. Kid wanted to hand the girl over to the army, but the captain said he had a mission to carry out. He told Kid to take the girl himself to the local government authorities. With that, the captain led his soldiers away on horseback. The kind-hearted Kid buried the black man's body. He also unexpectedly discovered a document on the man that confirmed the girl's identity. It turned out that when the girl was 3 years old, her parents had taken her out and were attacked, and only the 3-year-old girl had survived by sheer luck. After surviving, the girl had lived with indigenous people ever since, until she was discovered by the federal government 3 weeks earlier. The black man who had been killed was an employee of the federal government. He had been ordered to escort the girl back to her hometown and deliver her to her distant uncle for adoption, but they were attacked along the way. Looking at the young girl before him, so small yet burdened with so much sorrow, the kind-hearted Kid could not help but fall into silent melancholy. After 2 days of travel, Kid finally arrived in Red River Town. He intended to hand the girl over to the local authorities, but the moment the girl saw the federal soldiers, she immediately became agitated again. When she suddenly saw 2 federal soldiers walking past her, her previously calm demeanor instantly gave way to terrified frenzy, because her indigenous adoptive parents had been killed by federal soldiers, and the girl had survived only because she was white. No matter how frantically she struggled in panic, she was ultimately dragged by Kid and brought before the soldiers. Kid took out the document proving the girl's identity, hoping the soldiers could arrange as soon as possible to send her back to her original hometown and place her with her distant relatives. But the soldiers said they were overwhelmed with duties and short on manpower, and that it would take at least 3 months before they could arrange to send her home. One of the soldiers even told Kid to finish what he had started, suggesting that he personally escort the girl back. Yet they were more than 400 kilometers away from the girl's hometown, and Kid was not a man with idle time. He traveled constantly just to make a living and simply had no time to take the girl home. Because Kid was a newsreader, his job was to carry the latest newspapers from town to town and tell residents about the recent events happening around the world. So he could not possibly stay here and wait for 3 months. With no other choice, Kid entrusted the girl to a kind couple who ran a general store. He even paid the couple some living expenses, asking them to let the girl stay in their home for the next 3 months while waiting for the soldiers' arrangements. That very night, Kid began his work of reading the news to the townspeople. As they listened to the report of a ferry sinking, the shocked crowd could not help but murmur among themselves. While reading attentively, Kid suddenly received a piece of news that stunned him. The store owner came running through the rain, saying the girl had disappeared. Panicked, Kid immediately took lanterns with the shopkeeper and his wife and searched everywhere in the pouring rain. At last, Kid spotted the girl on a hillside. She was lying on the slope, shouting toward the great river across from her. Looking across the river, they could see many indigenous people migrating westward in order to survive. the girl was shouting desperately, begging the people on the other side of the river to wait for her, but the distance was too great, and the rain was pouring down so heavily that no one could hear her cries, although she had the face of a white child. Having been raised by indigenous people since she was young, she already saw herself as one of them. Seeing the girl consumed by sorrow and despair, Kid rushed forward and pulled her tightly into his arms, but the girl struggled wildly as if she had lost her senses, her eyes fixed on the direction where the indigenous people were disappearing in the distance. At that moment, even the always strong Kid felt tears welling silently in his heart. After exhausting all his strength, Kid finally brought the girl back to the shopkeeper's house once again, but the shopkeeper began to hesitate. He believed the girl would surely run away a second time. He told Kid that he had to watch over the store every day and simply had neither the time nor the energy to take care of her. The girl's helpless and desperate cries by the river continued to echo in Kid's heart. In the end, Kid resolved to personally take the girl and travel more than 400 kilometers to return her home. Early the next morning, Kid packed his belongings and prepared to take the girl home. The kind shopkeeper even gave Kid a gun for protection. It took great effort to dress the agitated girl in a new outfit, yet not long after they set out, the girl tried once again to put on her old indigenous clothing, but she had too many layers on, and after struggling for quite some time without success, she had no choice but to give up. She slowly took out a wolf bone from inside her clothes, a pendant given to her by her indigenous adoptive father. She gently placed the wolf bone necklace around her neck, her eyes staring fixedly toward the west behind them, because that was the direction most indigenous people were migrating in order to survive. Although Kid knew the girl could not understand English at all, he kept talking, doing everything he could to soothe her emotions, but the girl seemed unmoved by his efforts, turning her back to him in silence with visible anger. Having grown up in an indigenous tribe, the girl was deeply curious about Kid's luggage. Like a curious cat, she rummaged freely through the contents of Kid's trunk. Sitting beside her, Kid calmly explained that it was impolite to go through other people's belongings, but the girl could not understand a word he said and continued searching on her own. Whenever she found something edible, she would lick it once, and if it did not suit her taste, she would toss it aside. After who knows how long, she finally found a box of candy. After such a tragic and painful life, those candies tasted sweeter and more precious than ever. Satisfied at last, she immediately began stuffing the candy into her mouth in big bites. Seeing that half a jar of sugar was about to be eaten up, and wanting to protect his already modest savings, Kid had no choice but to quickly reach out to stop her. The girl seemed to understand what Kid had said earlier. She pulled out a bundle without opening it right away, instead lifting her head to glance at Kid. Only after Kid nodded did she open the bundle and begin rummaging through it. Inside, she found a photograph of a woman. Kid's expression grew solemn. He told the girl that it was his wife, and then began telling her the story of his wife. Although the girl could not understand Kid's words, she knew that the woman in the photograph must be very important to him. Early the next morning at dawn, Kid woke from his sleep only to find that the girl had disappeared. Thinking she had wandered off again, he panicked and hurried to search everywhere. Soon Kid realized that the girl had not gone far. She was standing not far away, staring blankly toward the west, because that was the direction most indigenous people were migrating in order to survive. Although the girl was white, she had lost her parents at a young age and was adopted by kind indigenous people. Now her indigenous adoptive parents had all been killed by federal soldiers. At this moment, she was completely without a home. Yet in her heart, she still believed she was one of the indigenous people. Kid understood what was in her heart, but he still believed that she should be sent to her original hometown, because she was white, and in his view, she should live among white people. Moreover, in her original hometown, there was a distant uncle who could take her in. After daybreak, Kid continued traveling east with the girl, heading toward her original hometown. Soon they arrived at a small town. At this time, the federal government was using various means to continuously expand its territory westward across America. Large numbers of citizens, responding to the government's call, were pouring into the West in search of opportunities to change their fate. For a time, this once desolate place instantly became crowded and bustling with noise. Seeing so many white people, and even federal soldiers, the girl who believed herself to be indigenous hid in the carriage in panic, curling up in fear of being noticed. To prevent the frightened girl from running off, Kid tightly held onto her clothing along the way. He took the girl into a small restaurant. When a bit of delicious food was placed on the table, the already starving girl immediately reached out and began eating with her hands. Kid patiently instructed her word by word, as if teaching a small child how to eat properly. The girl finally picked up the spoon, but the very next second she tossed it aside and continued eating with her hands. When she was happy, she even excitedly began singing an indigenous song. At that time, it was a period when conflicts and ongoing warfare between American settlers and indigenous people over land were still erupting. The girl's sudden indigenous song immediately drew wary glances from all the white patrons in the restaurant. Fortunately, she was only a child and had the face of a white girl. The kind female owner of the restaurant quickly spoke up to defuse the tension, faced with such a troublesome girl. Kid, who was escorting her all the way back to her hometown, was already physically and emotionally exhausted. He had to travel constantly during the day while dealing with the difficult girl. Whenever they arrived at a small town, Kid also had to use the evenings to read the news to the townspeople. He told people about the major events happening recently. This was his job and the only way he could barely make a living. Although the white girl who had been raised by indigenous people could not understand Kid's words, his tireless efforts from morning until night deeply affected her. Gradually she became quiet and obedient, finally no longer causing trouble, until one day, just after Kid had finished reading the news and was preparing to return to the small inn with the girl, they were suddenly blocked by 3 men. The men immediately offered money to buy the girl from Kid. Furious, Kid flatly refused, saying the girl was not merchandise, and quickly pulled her away. But the 3 men followed closely behind Kid, continuously raising their offer for the girl. One of the men even threatened Kid, saying that in this town, nothing he wanted to do could be stopped. Hearing the man's threat, the usually gentle Kid instantly flared with anger. Just as the situation was about to spiral out of control, several federal soldiers patrolling nearby appeared in time and stopped the confrontation. The men immediately made false accusations, claiming that Kid was a child trafficker and that they were merely trying to rescue the girl. Fortunately, Kid was a retired veteran and carried documents proving the girl's identity. After carefully checking Kid's identification and the documents, the soldiers allowed Kid and the girl to leave. The 3 troublemakers were taken away for questioning and statements. Sharp-minded Kid knew the 3 men would not let the matter rest, so he quickly packed his belongings and left the town overnight in haste. He drove at full speed without daring to stop, rushing desperately along the road. But at dawn, the 3 men rode after them once again. Seeing the distance between them closing, Kid knew escape was no longer possible, so he drove the carriage up a nearby hillside, hoping to hide among the dense vegetation. However, the mountain road was rough and difficult, and soon the carriage was stuck against a large rock and could not move forward. Kid pushed the carriage with all his strength while the girl struggled to drive the horses, but they could not get past the rock. At that moment, the 3 men dismounted and advanced toward Kid with guns in hand. At this life-or-death moment, Kid summoned all his strength and finally managed to push the carriage over the rock. Yet they were still discovered by the pursuers. Without hesitation, the men opened fire on Kid. Kid quickly pulled the girl down from the carriage and took cover behind it. The men shouted that if Kid agreed to sell the girl to them, they would let him leave. But the stubborn Kid insisted that the girl was not merchandise and was willing to risk his life for that belief. He sprang up and grabbed his rifle from the carriage, prepared to protect the girl to the very end. Abandoning the carriage, he fled deeper into the mountains with the girl, and the 3 pursuers relentlessly chased close behind them. Kid hid behind a massive rock, pulled out the handgun the general store owner had given him for protection, and seized the moment to fire decisively at the pursuers. A fierce gunfight erupted between the 2 sides. Kid adopted a tactic of firing a few shots and then retreating, then firing again and falling back once more, constantly maneuvering against the pursuers. After several exchanges of gunfire, both sides were already exhausted. The pursuers shouted again that they were willing to pay for the girl, raising the price even higher. Taking advantage of the moment while the men were shouting, Kid and the girl desperately pushed down a large boulder. Seeing the rock rolling straight toward him, one of the pursuers panicked and rushed out from cover. Kid seized the opportunity and fired, hitting the man. At that moment, Kid realized he had only a few bullets left and had no chance of taking down the remaining 2 pursuers. To protect the girl, he resolved to stay behind and buy time so she could escape alone. Although the girl could not understand Kid's words, her intelligence allowed her to grasp his intention. She immediately picked up the old rifle, indicating that it still had ammunition. Kid explained that the old rifle lacked stopping power and was usually only used for shooting birds, not for real combat. In the end, the girl quickly got to her feet and ran without looking back. Kid prepared himself to fight to the death. He shouted to the pursuers, pretending to consider their offer to buy the girl, trying to gain as much time as possible for her escape. The pursuers, having just lost one of their own, did not want to launch another direct assault, so they gave Kid 10 minutes to think it over. What Kid did not expect was that the girl had not fled. but had run desperately back to the carriage to retrieve coins from an iron bucket. Angrily, Kid demanded to know why she had returned. The girl stuffed the coins into the rifle cartridges, using them to increase the power of the old gun's ammunition. Her quick thinking instantly gave Kid, who had been ready to die, a renewed hope of survival. He immediately fired 2 shots from the old rifle at the pursuers. Seeing Kid use the bird gun, the sharp-eyed pursuers instantly realized he was nearly out of bullets. Kid then shouted that he agreed to sell the girl and even threw his handgun out in front of him. The cunning leader of the pursuers also tossed his handgun aside, signaling a willingness to negotiate. Yet he subtly motioned to his remaining accomplice to circle around Kid's flank with a gun, signaling him to seize a chance to shoot Kid. Meanwhile, Kid quietly loaded the 2 modified cartridges into the old rifle and slowly stood up. Believing Kid no longer had the ability to fight back, the flanking pursuer quickly tried to draw his weapon to shoot him, only for Kid to raise the old rifle and kill him with a decisive shot. Enraged, the leader grabbed his handgun again and resumed the fight. Kid hurriedly took the girl and fled farther up the mountain. He hid behind a giant boulder, preparing to ambush the approaching leader, and the moment the man appeared, Kid struck without hesitation and shot him dead. After this battle, Kid saw the girl's courage and intelligence in an entirely new light, and the girl, who had long been inwardly frightened after losing her home, finally found a long-lost sense of security with Kid. Her heart was no longer consumed by fear, and she even began to sing happily. These 2 people who could not understand each other's language began learning to speak to one another. Kid taught the girl English, and the girl taught him her indigenous language. Just as they were driving the carriage forward, talking and laughing, a man suddenly appeared and blocked their path. At the same time, the sound of guns being cocked came from behind them. Kid slowly turned around, only to find himself surrounded by more than a dozen men. He hurriedly explained that he merely wanted to enter the town ahead to rest and would continue traveling the next day. But the men said the town was under lockdown and no outsiders were allowed to enter. Kid immediately argued that federal law contained no such restriction against outsiders. The man replied that it was their own rule. As they spoke, they began rummaging through Kid's luggage, trying to find something valuable. They also noticed the latest newspaper in Kid's bundle. The armed leader quickly realized that Kid was a professional newsreader who traveled between towns making a living by reading newspapers aloud. So he took Kid into the town. After entering, Kid finally understood that the armed leader commanded a private militia of several hundred men. In the forests near the town, they were illegally hunting buffalo for profit. Not only that, the entire town had already been occupied by his private armed force. The mayor appointed by the federal government had become nothing more than a follower of the armed leader. The leader had become the lawmaker and the enforcer of the town, a true dictator in every sense. The townspeople lived in misery under his oppression. The reason the leader brought Kid here was to have him read a newspaper aloud. When Kid opened it, he realized it was a paper printed by the armed leader himself. The newspaper used the most extravagant language to praise the leader as a great pioneer of the times, lavishly glorifying his so-called achievements. The leader intended to use this paper to further consolidate his position as a dictator. Holding this special newspaper, Kid fell into deep inner conflict. From the bottom of his heart, he did not want to read this false praise for the leader, but he knew that if he refused, he and the girl might not live to see the sunrise. Glancing at the girl in the distance who was diligently collecting money, Kid finally began to read in order to protect her. Yet as he read, he gradually began to insert his own opinions. Years of reading the news had already turned Kid into a skilled speaker. He spoke many words encouraging people to resist exploitation and oppression. The townspeople, who had long suffered under the leader's tyranny, felt their blood boil with emotion. The leader quickly realized something was wrong and immediately ordered his men to stop Kid from continuing. But some of the enraged townspeople began fighting directly with the leader's men. The spirit of resistance seemed contagious. More and more people joined in, and the scene quickly descended into chaos. Kid seized the opportunity and hurriedly fled with the girl. When he reached his carriage, he discovered that the horses were gone. At that moment, the sound of a gun being cocked came from behind him. Kid slowly turned around and saw the armed leader aiming a gun at him. The leader did not shoot Kid immediately. Instead, he ordered his men to hold Kid tightly while he beat him brutally with fists and kicks. He wanted Kid to die slowly in agony. After venting his anger, the leader pulled out his handgun again, preparing to end Kid's life once and for all. But no one noticed that the girl, hiding behind the carriage, had quietly taken out a gun, and at the final critical moment, she pulled the trigger and killed the armed leader. It was the first time she had ever shot someone, and her heart was thrown into overwhelming turmoil. The leader's men immediately drew their guns, ready to shoot the girl. At that life-or-death moment, Another man who had long suffered under the leader's oppression rushed in and decisively fired. Saving the girl, the man slowly approached and saw the armed leader who had oppressed him for years lying on the ground, barely breathing and struggling at the edge of death. Filled with fury, he turned years of resentment into a sharp bullet and fired at the man who had tormented him, having narrowly survived. Kid quickly fled with the girl. The man who had just saved her chose to follow Kid and leave the town as well. After spending several days together, the man became deeply interested in Kid's work of reading the news to people. Kid held nothing back and shared all the experience he had accumulated over the years. In the end, the man resolved to become a newsreader like Kid, traveling from town to town. At parting, Kid even gave the man some of the latest newspapers as a farewell gift. After the long journey and shared hardships, Kid and the girl grew closer and more harmonious. He even joyfully drove the carriage while singing along with the girl's favorite Indigenous song. At that moment, Kid suddenly noticed that one of the wheels was damaged. He had no choice but to stop and get down to repair it. While Kid was fixing the wheel, the girl jumped off the carriage and began walking forward as if in a trance. She left the main road and continued walking despite Kid's calls. Kid had no choice but to drive the carriage slowly after her. Soon, a cluster of abandoned wooden houses appeared before them. This was once the home of the girl's Indigenous adoptive parents. The adopted girl had once enjoyed a happy childhood here, but war had destroyed everything. Her Indigenous adoptive parents had all been killed by federal soldiers in the conflict. The other Indigenous people who survived had been forced to migrate westward in order to survive. The girl stood silently in the empty room. The wind from outside gently brushed against her face. She picked up a doll she had once loved and slowly walked out of the wooden house. For the first time, she took Kid's hand on her own. At this moment, Kid had become her only family. Although she knew only a little simple English and could not fully understand Kid's words, he continued speaking gently, trying to comfort her sorrow. But just then, they drove onto a downhill slope, and the horses began running faster and faster. Kid desperately pulled on the reins, but the horses showed no sign of stopping. At that moment, the wheel that had just been repaired began to wobble again. Kid pulled hard on the brake, but the horses only ran faster. In the end, the carriage completely lost control. Ahead of them was a sharp turn on a steep slope, and if they did not stop immediately, the carriage would be destroyed and they would lose their lives. In that critical moment, Kid pushed the girl off the carriage with all his strength and jumped down himself. The out-of-control carriage hurtled straight down the steep hill. Once he regained his senses, Kid immediately ran with the girl to the bottom of the slope to check. Seeing the injured horse lying on the ground in painful agony, Kid pulled out his handgun and mercifully ended its suffering. With no other choice, Kid gathered what belongings he could carry and continued the journey on foot with the girl. Before long, the girl began limping as she walked. When Kid removed her shoes, he discovered that both of her feet had been rubbed raw and were bleeding. What made Kid even more desperate was that because they were traveling on foot so slowly, they were unable to reach the next town. Although they tried to conserve the water in the canteen and avoided taking large gulps, it was soon completely empty. The girl had already lost the ability to keep walking. Kid could only carry her in his arms and continue forward with difficulty. Just as Kid himself began stumbling and was on the verge of collapsing into complete despair, a cloud of dust rising in the distance instantly gave him hope of survival, because drifting dust meant that horses might be passing ahead. And where there were horses, there would be herdsmen. Kid immediately set the girl down and ran forward to seek help. But when he struggled up the slope, what he saw was not hope but utter despair. A vast wall of yellow sand, driven by a storm, was racing toward him. Kid turned and shouted the girl's name, but he was quickly swallowed by the roaring sand. He forced his exhausted body to move forward through the raging storm. When he finally reached the spot where he had left the girl, he found that she was gone. He shouted her name again and again, but there was no response. Overcome by exhaustion, Kid eventually collapsed into the endless sandstorm. In his haze, he saw the girl standing not far away. Looking at him, he called out her name loudly, but she turned and walked away as if she had not heard him. Then the white girl who had been raised by Indigenous people slowly walked toward a group of Indigenous riders. Kid fell instantly into despair. Just as Kid was lost in sorrow, the girl slowly walked toward him leading a horse. It turned out that she had told the tribal chief her story in her Indigenous language. The kind chief had given her a horse. In her heart, she had already come to see Kid as her only family. With one horse between them, the two continued their long journey. After enduring countless hardships, they finally arrived at the girl's original hometown. When Kid told her that this was the hometown of her biological parents and that he would leave her with her distant uncle, The girl immediately became agitated and unwilling. The uncle suddenly noticed two strangers approaching him. After crossing such a long distance, Kid had finally brought the girl back home. Kid carefully told him everything the girl had been through, hoping he would treat her kindly, because at such a young age she had already endured so much suffering. Kid hoped she could receive an education and read many books, but the man said his family was poor. There was endless farm work to be done, and there was not even a single book in the house. He was taking the girl and only to add a free laborer to the family. Hearing this, Kid felt a deep sorrow and his face fell. Along the journey he had cared for the girl with devotion, and after so many days together she had already taken a place in his heart. Yet the man before him was her distant uncle, and as an outsider he had no right to interfere in another family's arrangements. In the end, he could only rise and leave in disappointment. When the girl heard that Kid was about to leave, she simply turned her back to him and stared out the window in silence. Kid mounted his horse and cast one last glance at her through the window. The girl remained expressionless and silent, even turning her gaze away. Only after Kid rode off did she secretly shift her eyes back to him. Watching his departing figure, her heart was filled with sorrow. She had already regarded Kid as her only family. She had never imagined that he would leave her behind with two strangers. After parting from the girl, Kid continued on his way. Without her company, he could not help but feel lonely. 5 years later, Kid finally returned to his own hometown. After arguing with his wife years ago and refusing to admit fault, he had left home in anger and become a newsreader traveling between towns. He never expected that his departure would last 5 years. What he never imagined was that when he pushed open the door of his home, it was empty. He thought his wife had left him, but when he went to a friend to ask for news, the friend told him that his wife had passed away from illness 2 years earlier. The kind friend had buried her in the garden beside the church. Upon hearing of his wife's death, the already disheartened Kid fell into complete despair. The journey escorting the girl had made him understand that staying with family was life's greatest happiness, yet he had never been given the chance to apologize. His friend told him it was not that his wife had denied him the chance, but that he had returned too late. Those words left Kid in deep silence. He slowly walked to the garden beside the church and sincerely apologized at his wife's grave. He removed the wedding ring he had worn for half his life and placed it into a small box, as if placing himself inside as well. He set the little box, which held his ring and all his memories, upon her tombstone. He wanted that box to remain there in his place, keeping vigil beside her forever. His wife's death left Kid completely alone, and it made him realize that one should never do something that will bring lifelong regret. He thought of the girl he had left behind. Her image appeared before his eyes again and again. Determined not to live with regret, he resolutely mounted his horse and left his hometown once more. Riding toward the girl's town, he crossed hills and passed through forests, pressing forward without hesitation or rest. When he arrived at the distant uncle's home, he discovered that in an attempt to discipline her, the uncle had tied the girl to a wooden post with a rope. Kid slowly walked toward her, but still immersed in the sorrow of feeling abandoned. The girl quickly stood up and moved away from him. Ignoring everything else, Kid stepped forward and swiftly untied the rope. Seeing this, the uncle grabbed his rifle and approached quickly. Kid firmly told him that he was taking the girl away. He sincerely apologized to the girl, admitting that he should never have left her. He promised that for the rest of his life he would care for and protect her. The girl turned to look at her uncle, who lowered his rifle and silently allowed her to leave. Her eyes were already red with tears as she slowly walked toward Kid, toward her only family. The two embraced tightly. At that moment, these two lonely souls who had no one else finally found a home in each other. They shared no blood relation, yet they became the closest family in the world. Afterward, Kid continued traveling between towns, reading the news and telling people about important events, and the girl became his assistant, staying by his side forever. I am a movie enthusiast, and I look forward to our next encounter.